All right, everyone. I see everyone's coming in. Welcome in, everyone. My name is Malin Oliver. I'm the program manager here at the U.S.-China Education Trust. And before our program begins, I want to say a few short words about the Q&A session following our discussion today. Throughout the program, we welcome you to submit any questions you have for our panelists using the Q&A button that can be found at the bottom of your screen. We encourage you to include your name and affiliation as well, but this is optional. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Ambassador Block, to begin the program.
Good evening, everyone from Washington, D.C., and good morning to those of you in China. On behalf of the U.S.-China Education Trust, I welcome you to the sixth webinar in our Asian Women Trailblazers series. Today, we have with us two passionate champions of social justice for Asian Americans. You're all going to be part of a conversation today as we dissect the Asian American and Pacific Islander, or AAPI, community and learn why social justice has been so elusive for this group, the fastest growing racial group in America. As you all may know, the AAPI community is made up of more than 22.6 million people, 7% of the US population, representing more than 30 countries, speaking at least 100 languages. AAPIs have faced, endured, and fought against discrimination, racism, and persecution, going back to when they first came to the US in the 19th century. The surge in anti-Asian violence and harassment during the pandemic was nothing new. It was just a part of a long history of brutal bigotry against Asian Americans that have been erased from public consciousness. Most of us know about the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. But how many of us know about the Chinese massacre of 1871? When a white mob ran through Los Angeles, Chinatown, and lynched, yes, lynched, 19 Chinese residents, including a 15-year-old boy. And how many of us know that the first restrictive US immigration law based solely on race targeted the Chinese and banned the entry of Chinese women into the US in 1875? This was followed 7 years later by the infamous Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which banned Chinese men as well. By 1924, the US had taken steps to shut down practically all immigration from Asia. Race massacres that destroyed Black towns like Rosewood in Florida and Greenwood in Oklahoma are increasingly becoming common knowledge. But what do we know, if anything, about Tacoma, Eureka, and the over 200 towns in California alone that forcibly drove out the Chinese residents and razed their homes to the ground? And that was between 1840 and 1906. These Chinese explosions and massacres have largely been forgotten, whitewashed, if you will. This legacy of exclusion, expulsions, and massacres has left Asian Americans today feeling more foreign, unwelcome, and invisible than all other racial groups. This year, some 75% of Chinese Americans report fears for their safety. Hey, I now pause and look around when I enter our metro system. So another 80% of Asian Americans acknowledge feeling not being fully accepted in America. The model minority myth, moreover, has masked anti-Asian racism and hate, leading many Americans to believe AAPIs are successful, highly educated, and well off, and generally not discriminated against. A racial wedge often used against other minorities. The surge in anti-Asian violence during the pandemic, however, has exposed a constant lesson of American history, that during fraught times, Asian Americans make easy scapegoats. The perpetual foreigner, the menacing outsider who is never fully American. AAPIs are taking action. They are challenging existing stereotypes that define this community, not only to fight racism and discrimination, but also to address the psychological traumas embedded in the Asian American experience. It's killing the younger generation. New research found that the youth mental health crisis is taking a heavy toll on the AAPI community, as suicide is the first leading cause of death for AAPI young adults aged 20 to 24. Hey, 20 and to 24-year-olds, that's too young to die. It's time now for us to explore some of the most harmful effects of the model minority myth and Asian American stereotyping to gain a more accurate picture of AAPI community so that we can better serve the community and achieve social justice for all Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. To start our conversation, let me first introduce our two wonderful speakers. Daphne Kwok, alphabetical. After dedicating her life to service and promotion of AAPIs, is now Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at AARP, America's largest association of old people, people over 50, where she now works to empower AAPIs to choose how they live as they age. Daphne, I need your advice. For 11 years, she was the executive director of the Organization of Chinese Americans, where she fought for the civil rights of all Asian Americans. She was also the first elected chair of the National Council of APAs, a network of national Asian Pacific American organizations. In addition, Daphne served as executive director of the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies and chair of the Advisory Commission on AAPIs in the Obama administration. Next, Bo Thao-Urabe. She is a pillar of the Hmong community. She is the founder and president of Seed, Grow, Bloom. What a lovely name. A consulting firm that helps executive leaders and organizations change systems and cultures. A refugee child from Laos, her experiences at the intersections of war, poverty, immigration, gender, culture, and race now inform her leadership and her work today. Bo was founder and executive director of the Coalition of Asian American Leaders and executive director of Hmong National Development and the Women's Association of Hmong and Lao, and served as senior director of Asian Americans Pacific Islanders in Philanthropy, and also a member of the Obama Advisory Commission on AAPIs. Now, Bo and Daphne, thank you for joining us today. Both of you have essentially dedicated your lives to fighting for equality, access, and the rights of the AAPI community. What motivated you to do that? And over the years, what changes have you seen? Are AAPIs better off today than when you first began your activism? Who would like to begin?
Daphne, why don't you start? I'll defer.
Okay, Bo. All right. And then you're going to start the next one after this. Well, first of all, thank you so much Julia, for the tremendous opportunity. I'm so honored to actually share a stage with you. It's so after 30 plus years of knowing you in my very first job coming out of college when I was with the Organization of Chinese American Women. And I want to pay tribute to Pauline Sway, which I understand this series is in her honor. She was my very, very first boss. So she's the one that got me involved in the Asian American community, literally just out of college. And you were the board chair. So it's been a tremendous honor to have worked with you at the beginning of my career and then also continue to be able to do so and now. And so your question of, how have we gotten involved? It actually, growing up, I grew up in Northern Virginia. And at the time in the 1960s, 1970s, it was not very diverse at all. And in school, my brothers and I really were the only Asian Americans. There were hardly any African Americans or Hispanics. And it wasn't really until college, and I went to Wesleyan University in Connecticut. And when I entered in the class of 1984, so this was in the fall of 80, we were the largest out of class of 600 incoming freshmen. It was the largest Asian American, Asian student group coming in. It was 29 out of 600, and then plus the other 3 years. So maybe there were about 100 Asian Americans out of 2,400 students. But to me, I was like in heaven. I had never been around so many Asian Americans. And so I actually got involved with the Asian American student group on campus. I thought I was just socializing and having fun. Literally, I was just partying, having fun. Little did I know what I was doing there was actually starting to organize already, putting on events, identifying issues and speakers, publicizing the event, putting agendas together for meetings, trying to raise money to bring in speakers. And of course, I didn't realize what we were doing at the time, but it's actually coalition building as well. We had a very large African American student body on campus. And so we started working with African American students, Hispanic students, asking the administration for more students of color, more faculty of color, more administrators of color. I never realized what I was doing at the time was actually coalition work and advocacy. And when I speak to people nowadays, I say, I didn't realize, but all those skills I was learning at that time were skills that I've used ever since in my work. Fast forward 30, 40 years later, right now, how have I seen the Asian American community and the civil rights community blossom in a way? When I really started getting involved in the work was 1990. I was the executive director of the Organization of Chinese Americans, and it was exactly myself and one assistant, and the Japanese American Citizens League, which is much older than OCA, had a Washington, D.C. representative, so that was one person, and then administrative assistant. So there are exactly 4 of us working for the entire national Asian American community in the area of civil rights in Washington, D.C. And I tell people this is before really computers, and this was before emails and internet. So this was in the dark ages. So, you can see what it was like in 1990, and here we are in the year 2023. And I'll just say one fact to show the growth of the Asian American community and the presence here in DC is now the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans, which Bo also was part of when we started it, and which I was the first chair of. There were just a handful of Asian American organizations, national groups with staff focused on advocacy. Now there are over 40 plus organizations that are part of NCAPA. So that just sort of shows you a rise. We have moved forward. There's absolutely more political representation. There's more representation in the media. There's more representation in Hollywood. But in other areas, we have actually gone backwards as well. And so I hope we have a chance to discuss more of that, because all of it is of tremendous concern to many of us. But I'll turn it over to Bo now.
Thank you, Daphne, and thank you, Julia, for the invitation and having me join the session too. It's an honor, and I'm really grateful for leaders like Daphne, because I think that that, you know, when you talk about change, I think just being able to both acknowledge, as Daphne said, that when she arrived in DC, there were really only a handful of organizations and leaders. And then when I arrived, there were a few more. Still count on, you know, two hands, but now we have many more. So I feel like, you know, that organizing that people started to do, and then to give form to it so that there could be organizations to serve community and to be able to bring the community issues to the forefront of policy in the heart of DC. I think it shows how the community has grown and has learned to be able to create the kinds of vehicles that can serve the needs, but also envision the future, a future that is more inclusive and things like that. And I also know that, you know, being a child refugee, and then being an Asian American, of course, but also being Hmong by heritage, I think that that experience is, you know, is also unique, right? And being a part of the story of the community, and being able to arrive in DC to see that there were organizations like OCA and JACL and, you know, others that served other populations, but also to figure out, so how do we all work together, right? How do we all work together? And what does it mean for us to have come from very unique communities and have had different pathways here, but now to land in this country where the future is ours to also shape? And how do we do that in the construct of being Asian Americans? And so I'm grateful to have had that kind of, to be surrounded by people who've thought about that, and to then be invited to help to contribute to that future. In terms of just personally, you know, I got involved in this work mainly out of necessity, coming as a refugee child and having parents who had not had formal education, and then arriving in this country, and then we were resettled, and a lot of us were resettled in areas where there were very few other Hmong families, predominantly, you know, happened to be more poorer communities, in particular Black communities. And so navigating those systems, and, you know, everybody is always hopeful, right, when they come to America, but then they realize that there are roadblocks, and eventually I am very fortunate that I got to go to school here, and realized that I spoke more English than my parents, and happened to be the talkative child. So my parents took me everywhere and I got to, you know, go with them from, you know, places like trying to order a hamburger at McDonald's, to going to their doctor's appointment, to all kinds of things, and not so unlike many other immigrant children, I think, but eventually realized that I could serve that function, but I also saw things that could improve in those systems. And as I experienced things, I was able to talk about it. And then as I talked about it, there were leaders within those systems who listened and who said, oh, how, you know, how could we improve, right? What could be done differently? And so, as Daphne said, you don't know what those things are called, you just do them because they were important to you or to your family, and eventually realize that in this country, we have such things as, you know, this independent third nonprofit sector, and that happened to be a place where I could organize with other people and participate really in shaping democracy in this country, and help to carve out different solutions. And so I feel like, you know, many of us, there's that personal connection, but also it's a desire to ensure that we are not just people who live here, but that we can be leaders who contribute proactively to shaping our communities. And so that's a little bit about my story.
Well, now you both talk about improvements.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give some examples? What kinds of improvements you think have actually occurred and have made a positive contribution to AAPI's lives?
Well, I can start just from my observations. I think, there is still much more to do. But I think some things that have come from the work of so many people is something like data, right? When we first came to this country, you couldn't even really tell who Asians were, and so I know that as a Hmong person, we didn't have the ability to indicate that we were Hmong on something like the census, right? And it took a lot of advocacy for the Census Bureau to open a blank line to allow for smaller communities like the Hmong community to be able to write the word Hmong on the census so that eventually we would have data. And data is really important because data drives a lot of systemic decisions. And so when we started to get that information, then we could start to understand the nuances that exist in our Asian American community and to see communities that should be celebrated for their success, but to also see where did we have challenges, right? Who were communities who may have different types of struggle. And so I think data has always been a part of the advocacy agenda of Asian Americans. And it's both an acknowledgement that we value our heritage. We want that uniqueness. And that is an asset. But it's also about being able to see the diversity within the diversity and recognizing that we need that kind of nuance in order to serve the community better. So so definitely that is something that I have been a part of and know that has taken really community leadership to be able to cause systemic change, and it's ongoing. But we have much more information now than we ever did, decades ago.
But Bo, you raised a very interesting point, because I think data is a double-edged sword, particularly for the AAPI community. So let's go there, because one of the problems, I think, for AAPIs is that we are so diverse, but we are seen as a monolith. I think you would agree that the misconception of Asian Americans as a monolithic model minority has distorted the diverse culture, socioeconomic status, and experiences of AAPIs. What do you think has been the impact of this misconception? Because sure, with data, perhaps you can gain more services. But it seems to me, on the other hand, that because of the misconceptions about the AAPI community, the data has served to actually limit service in terms of the needs of the most vulnerable populations of the AAPI community. And I know, Daphne, that you have a big deal, a big thing about disaggregating AAPI data. Maybe, we need to talk about this, because I think that is one of the major issues that we need to really bring forward, clarify, and at least get the ear of our policymakers so they understand that the AAPI community is not monolithic. We have huge gaps in terms of income, educational levels in all sectors. So I think you are better experts on this than I.
Well, I would say that actually, Bo, right? When we were with the President's Commission, I often say that it didn't matter what meeting, what agency we were meeting with, or who in the community we were meeting with. The number one issue that we were addressing was data, disaggregated, the need for disaggregated data. So it didn't matter whether we were talking to the Department of Education, whether we're talking to HHS, whether we're talking to HUD, all those meetings were to impress upon them the critical importance that for the collection of disaggregated data. I think especially for small communities like Bo's Hmong community, right? We need to really bring up the needs, the very, very specific needs of those communities, the smaller communities, so that they can get the services that they and resources that they need. And so therefore, actually, as you say, Julia, how have we progressed over the last several decades? I would say the education of the AAPI community about data has been one. And it's fantastic. No matter what conferences we go to, right, Bo? There's always a session on data. There's always conversation about the need to do more on data and data disaggregation. I think, and so one of the things right now that I'm working on with AARP is, I'm sick and tired of being, told that no, we can't do AAPI research because AAPI's numbers, they're statistically insignificant. And it's like, okay, how are we going to solve that? And so right now we have a major project with the University of Chicago, NORC, AARP, to build a panel, a research survey panel of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders that can be done in language. And so that people, after we build it out, that people can use this panel so they don't have to build their own panel every time they do research. So we can also cut down the cost. It's 8 times more expensive to do research on the AAPI community, especially in language. And so therefore no one can afford it. So no one does it. So there's no data on our community. And so I think we've come a long way from the community to be advocates around data. And finally, slowly, policymakers are understanding the importance of data.
Bo?
Yeah, I think, your point about how generally data is only reported on at the very highest level, creating those, those common beliefs about Asian Americans, right? I think I agree that that is a challenge, right? And so it's really important that as we work in communities that we are able to continue to help communities to understand that we should not just take data and the way that data is reported at face value, especially if it doesn't represent our experience, right? Who gets to tell the story of that data is really important. And then I want to also say that, data is not only for pointing out the needs and the most marginalized in our communities, it's also to point where we have successes and where we have potential solutions that systems could adopt, right? I remember someone pointing out, or when we broke down the disaggregated data here in the state of Minnesota, where the Hmong community is the largest Asian American ethnic group, and but it has among one of the lowest household incomes, right? So, but then when you look at home, houselessness, I would, and things like that, it's a very small number. So they were curious about how you have a population that doesn't have a high household income, but doesn't have the houselessness issues that they would expect to see from low income families. And I said, well, then you have to look at how many generations live together, right? So it had the highest a number of households that were multi-generational, and the average size was 7, not 3 or 2 point whatever, right? And so, so I think that, as creative leaders, we have to be able to look at that data and understand that it's not just to point out where there are gaps, it can point us to some of the answers. And when we invest in communities, we also have to invest in what works. Communities help each other, and that's not always recognized in data. But when you allow for communities to help to interpret that data to say, how should we look at this data to solve something like, housing, what solutions might we arrive at? So I think your point is right, that generally there are generalizations, and that's where some of the problems are, because then we don't get to see the nuances, but also I do think there's a lot of success to celebrate, and that can be told through, as we look for solutions to different things, right? And I also know in the state of Minnesota, I know a lot about the data here because that's where I spent my life's work is Asian Americans start small businesses at the highest rate. We contribute the most to the economy in terms of hirings, taxes, and all of those things. But who we invest in for small businesses is a very small number. So we have to point that out because that means the burden of these small businesses are carried by families. And if their small businesses don't succeed, families lose their whole life saving, right? So then we have to say, that's a problem. So we have this data that shows that there's very high entrepreneurship, but people are saving and using all of their savings to start these businesses without the help of small business loans or grants or those kinds of things. What can we do differently? So I tend to think of, Daphne knows this. I would rather not be talking about data. I would rather be talking about solutions, but oftentimes the solutions come from how we look at the data. So.
Well, I think how we look at the data is important, but let me move on to another topic. Showcasing successes is something that certainly USCET believes in. This is why we created this program. We wanted the general public to understand that Asian Americans are Americans too, and we have made contributions to this society. And of course, we want to showcase successful women, particularly like you, and we have. But Asian Americans are also, in a way, characterized, and I should say in a way, are characterized as the model minority. So if that leads the public to buy into the myth, and Americans, I think, have bought into the myth, perceiving AAPIs collectively as successful, high earners, well-educated, and overrepresented in elite universities and institutions. Many would ask, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with being characterized as successful? Isn't that good? What do you think?
Well, I think, most definitely, right? For the AAPI community, we are on both sides of the spectrum and in between. Yes, we have very highly successful individuals, right? But I think it's also the role and responsibility of those that have made it to also really continue and to use their bully pulpit, to use their platform, to be, and the rooms that they are in, to be able to continue to inform and educate about really that whole spectrum of the AAPI community. And I think, and just that we are using the term AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander, which is inclusive of the Native Hawaiian. So we wanted to talk about Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders. But so we want to make sure that for those of us that have those platforms, that we be able to use it to inform that yes, many of us have made it to the top, but there are many that have not, and many of it's due to systemic issues that are addressing our communities. One of the stats which I often throw out there to demystify the model minority is that more than 50% of our Asian American Pacific Islander community go to community colleges and junior colleges. It's not the private four-year institutions. And just that one stat alone will already inform so much. But I think it's imperative that for those of us that are in positions where we can influence and educate, that it is our role and responsibility to do so.
Yeah, I think that we do have you know, that historical context of kind of just the framing of Asian Americans as model minorities. And that's also set in the context of kind of race in this country, right? And so I think it's important to both recognize that in some ways, that positive view maybe perhaps you know, enables the community to I guess receive kind of just some openness to from whether it's employers or places and things like that. But I think, Julie, as you said, it's created an invisibility in particular to the specific needs. And so I think we've gotten to the place of recognizing now that we don't want to be invisible, right? Like we don't want to walk into a room and be left alone to kind of just do our work. And I think there are different studies that have been conducted to say that even though we have Asian Americans who are at some of the our nation's most largest companies, most of them are not in senior executive positions because of how Asian Americans are perceived. Like they're perceived to be good workers, but not perceived to be good leaders. I think those are other additional stereotypes that are harmful beyond just the model minority, right? Asian Americans must be leaders in all levels of companies if we want success, not just to be seen as hard workers. And I think that you know, recognizing that there may be cultural things like we value, you know, the collective cohesion, and so sometimes we tend to not maybe be as individual or things like that. I think those are kind of cultural nuances too that are important to talk about, that that maybe also have implications for how Asian Americans lead and are put in leadership positions that go beyond just kind of, you know, the model minority. Because I can certainly say that you know, I don't know what it is, right? But I have been stopped by the police and I have been let go. But when I talk to my Black friends, that has not been the case for them, right? So that has something to do with maybe the way that I am perceived about, you know, the mistake that I made and then I was let go versus my friend who is Black who didn't get that chance, right? And I can't say enough about like just being able to understand the larger context of race and what it means to, you know, be an Asian American during this time, and also what are the other things that we might consider, because we want all of our people to be able to lead fully into this society. Yeah.
Bo, I think also we would also say too is that if we're perceived as being model minority, that we're all good and that we do not want to be used as a wedge community against the African American Hispanic community in particular, that we should never ever be put in that position. We should always speak out against that. We don't want to be seen as a poster children, poster community, poster population. It's like, well, if the Asians can do it, why can't you do it? And we know that we can never be used in that way.
That is a very important point. And you know that the model minority myth has been used often as a racial wedge against other minorities. But let's move to that point. But can you provide some examples of how model minority characterizations have been used as a wedge? Anything? Or maybe I should
you want to take that one
I
first?
should go to this question. And
Yeah.
this question is for Bo. Okay. The conviction of former Minneapolis police officer Bo Thao, a Hmong American, in abetting the death of George Floyd has raised attention on the sometimes fraught relationship between AAPI and Black communities. How did Thao's conviction actually impact the Hmong community and the relationship between the AAPI and Black communities in Minneapolis? Has there been anything good to come out of it? Have there been acts of interracial solidarity coming out of this tragedy?
Yeah, at the time of the killing of George Floyd, I was executive director of the Coalition of Asian American Leaders, and that's a network of like 5,000 leaders from across the state here. And so it's pretty broad. And I think very early on, we put out a statement about the recognition that the killing of George Floyd is in itself wrong, right? And the fact that Officer Tou Thao was involved and stood watch over what happened as George Floyd was dying meant that we also recognize his participation in a failed system, right, to protect people's lives. And so I think that, that for me was easy. It doesn't mean that it was easy for the community because, it's a very familial, collective culture. So when one family is hurt, a lot of people feel hurt. And I think that Tou Thao's family was trying to figure out how to get support for him, right? And how to make sure that he had legal representation and all of those things. But I think that there were a lot of conversations about in this time, especially during COVID, when our community had already experienced disproportionate suffering because of anti-Asian sentiments. When I was executive director, I would say that was probably the one of the few times in my life where the community called me like at all hours of the day, just really concerned and telling me for the first time about the racist, xenophobic stigmatization that they were experiencing at school, in public spaces and things that, and because things were shut down, they didn't know where to go, right? So our communities were infected at disproportionate rates because of the multi-generational households, and people were already really worried and concerned. And then when that happened and they could see on camera that one of the people who was involved was a son of the community, there was a lot of concern. But I think that we were able to call meetings fairly quickly to talk about how important it was for us to stand in solidarity with the Black community against anti-Blackness, because we also understand what it is to have anti-Asian sentiments, right, and expressions and harm experienced in our community, and that we needed to be in solidarity when things fail so that we can protect each other. So I think that created a lot of collaborations and solidarity, and we didn't see, there have been previous incidents of anti-Hmong or anti-Asian things where I think the community was also supported by the Black community and things like that. So I think that history builds the foundations for how communities continue to work with each other.
Daphne?
Well, I would say that especially with the Asian, Black, Hispanic coalition work, that so much needs to be done at the local level and the national level as well too. And throughout all these decades of my work, one of the things that I really encouraged our Asian American community to do is to be able to join those African American organizations, the Hispanic community, or the LGBTQ, or the Native American. We need to be part of those organizations before crises happen. We need to go to their conferences. We need to be able to invite their leaders to our conferences as speakers. We need to have a lot more conversation and dialogue. One of the things I've often said is that I think that one of the reasons why our community does not truly understand, appreciate, especially the African American community, Black community, is that granted, most Asians came to the US after 1965 because of the Immigration Act. And so therefore they weren't necessarily here during the 1960s, the civil rights movement. But what we really need to do is, we as Asian Americans, we need to learn about the 1960s, because we are indebted, every single one of us is indebted to the Black African American community. Granted, there were Asian Americans involved in the movement, right? But it was a small number. But we now have to learn about the blood, sweat, tears, the deaths, really, of the Black community and what it's meant for us. One of the things I continuously dream about is I would love to be able to take Asian Americans down into the Deep South and follow the civil rights trail so that we can really learn from history. And I think we would all be much better for it. And I think that would bring us all closer together. I think Bo and I had the great honor and privilege working here in DC. We are part of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, now called the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, made up of over 100 of the top civil rights organizations. So we were in very close partnership with the NAACP, Urban League, at the time National Council of Raza, which is now UNIDOS, with the American Jewish Community, with the Anti-Defamation League on all the hate crimes. So we were working in a much larger civil rights coalition, and that kind of work has to continue at the national level, but very much so at the local level.
Well, Victoria Moy, if you're in the audience, I think your advanced question has been answered. But let me throw it back to you again, this question. I think Asian Americans should learn more about the Black experience in America. But it really, how about the other way around? How about the need of other minority groups and Americans, white Americans, to know more about Asian experience in America? Because Asian Americans are much more invisible than other groups. Our stories have not been told. Our histories have not been taught in the schools. And because the public doesn't really understand the history of racism against Asian Americans in this country, the model minority myth will never go away. So I think Victoria's question, I think, also speaks to that side of the equation. What would you say to that?
Well, I mean, I'm in agreement that there is certainly a lot more that our education system can do to be able to tell the truth about all of the history of this country, and in all the ways in which our communities have entered, and how things like exclusion policies have created the kinds of patterns that we see, right, for our communities. And so I agree. I mean, I don't think that, I went through my whole K-12 education not actually learning anything about the Asian American experience, right? I think I read a chapter about, the Vietnam War, which was the closest thing that was related to me. And that wasn't even about me, right? And things like that. And then I ended up having to pay for my own courses in college to learn about Asian American history. So I think that all of our young people lose something by not being able to be afforded the kinds of education that tells the stories of our Asian ancestors, right, who helped to both build this country, but also what policy has done to our to our community. And I think that that's right. And so I think that inclusion is important, because that education that our children gets either enables them to understand their own communities, their own families' histories set in the context of this country, but also then helps us to understand the larger swath of how Asian American history intersects with other communities' histories, right? And so to Daphne's point, I think that's really right, that, the model minority myth, if you will, if you go dig in history, you'll remember that before the civil rights movement and the activation of the civil rights movement to the national level in that way, Asian Americans were not thought of particularly as minorities. They were thought of as disease. They were thought of as, these coolies who were trying to take white people's jobs, and these foreign people that people just wanted to stay away from. And it was really the push of the Black community demanding justice and demanding equality that then this narrative about a minority population rose. And that came from the media, right? That came, and then eventually it became kind of normalized. And that happened all before the policy changed to allow for more Asian Americans to come. So I just want to say, I think that it's complicated, but I would generally agree that history is not taught. It's been very exclusive, and Asian American history absolutely should be a part of what is taught to all of our children.
I'll say actually 2 takeaways from this is actually right now, which is fantastic. There's a groundswell on the advocacy front at the state level right now to get Asian American studies into the K through 12 curriculum. So Illinois passed it, I believe New Jersey passed it. There are a number of states that have legislation lined up. So we should all be working to get those pieces of legislation passed so that we can get it into K through 12 curriculum. The second thing is, we all know that May is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. And I would put a challenge out to everybody that, well, first of all, it shouldn't be just 31 days out of the year, but should be 365. But since we have May designated, let's make sure that for May 2024, that instead of having cultural heritage or food, events to celebrate APA Heritage Month, let's talk about history. Let's use those opportunities to inform and educate around the diversity within our Asian American Pacific Islander communities, but also to talk about history, our contributions, as you say, Julia. Contributions in the broadest sense, because in all the different fields now, we can point to so many examples, but absolutely, we need to continue to educate.
Let's do it, and let AARP take the lead and support all this. But
we have been, absolutely.
Daphne, I have a question for you. And I think you'll like this question. Because, we all love to hear about how you're empowering AAPIs to choose. I love that phrase, how AAPIs choose to live as they age. And everybody is aging. Nobody does not age, okay? So tell us about your project with Richard Louis and his film, Unconditional. Caring for the elderly has become a universal issue.
Well, as we know, that demographically, right?
Absolutely, but let me finish the question.
Oh, okay.
But Richard Louis' story is particularly poignant, and because it illustrates how the AAPI community has been impacted by the high cost of American healthcare. And what role does this play in many Asian cultures, which respect elders and prioritize childcare? That's a huge challenge and burden. I shouldn't say burden, because we all want to do it, but the implications are huge for the AAPI community.
Absolutely. So I've been at AARP for 10 years now, and AARP covers a number of issues, whether it's around health and wellness, whether about financial. But I've really used my time at AARP to focus in on caregivers, because I'm also of the age, right, that around my circle of friends, we're all caring for our elderly parents. And I am extremely grateful. And they're on right now watching because they want to see you, Julia.
Oh my
My
goodness.
mother,
Hi.
89 years old, and my dad, who's 97 years old. I'm extremely grateful that I'm able to care for them. But the thing is that, so I'm using my time to try to inform and educate the Asian American community about caregiving, because as we all know, we don't see ourselves as caregivers. It's part of filial piety. It's part of our duties. We're just doing it because that is how we're brought up. But what I want to really be able to do is let people know that we are caregivers, so that if you need to get information and resources, you will know where to go. So AARP, a major part of our work is around to help support family caregivers, the resources, how do you finance caregiving? And on the advocacy side, we're constantly fighting for caregivers, tax credits and whatnot. So, about 7 years ago, and Richard and I have known each other for quite a while, because when I was at Angel Island, he was with CNN and he came out to do a story because his family actually came through Angel Island as well. And to this day, he says, Daphne, he did a 6-minute package. And, on TV, that's an incredibly long period of time, but he did it about Angel Island. And so we've gotten to work together over the years. But I had learned that his father, he was starting to care for his father and caregiving. So I asked him one time about that. And as we were talking, he said, Daphne, do you want me to tell my story? And I'm like, he's such a public figure, MSNBC anchor. I was like, wow, absolutely. If he would be willing to be so bold and courageous to share his personal journey, his family's journey about caring for his father with Alzheimer's, we absolutely wanted to be there. So we were able to film 7 years ago while his father was just in the beginning of the Alzheimer's, and to be able to follow his father's story. Unfortunately, last year he passed. And so therefore, Richard has been a major spokesperson for us. I've been with him throughout the country as he's speaking and as he's sharing, especially as a male caregiver. When I speak, I often throw out there, and I'll throw it out to our listeners right now, what percentage of caregivers do you think are male? It's actually 40%. And
Wow.
It's much higher than most people. Most people would automatically think they're almost all women, but 40% are male. 25% are the younger generation. And so Richard has been able to share his caregiving story to get people to realize they're caregivers. And I've literally seen people realize that they are caregivers. And so we have supported now 2 of his documentaries, Sky Blossom and Unconditional, which just premiered in May. It's already had a White House screening. It was just screened last week on Capitol Hill. But through this, we're hoping to really get people to know that they're not alone, that we will all either be caregivers, need care, or have given care. All of us will fall into them. That's something that the First Lady, Rosalynn Carter, has stated. But I think all of us need to prepare early before it's too late. And this is what I want to be able to help our community do.
Well, we're approaching the end of our time, but I don't think we can really leave this conversation without addressing the issue of AAPI representation, which, Bo, you mentioned about, how AAPIs are in institutions and they hold certain senior positions and so on. Because without representation, we will never have a voice in the policies that affect our community. So, and I must say that Rosetta Lai, if you're out there, we're now addressing your question. I believe in giving the audience participation a lot of, action. And so we're starting a little bit earlier, but it is an issue that we needed to discuss before ending the program in any sense. I shouldn't say ending the program, before opening to the audience. And we happen to mesh Rosetta's question and this issue of AAPI representation. I'm not sure that everyone is aware that Asian Americans are underrepresented across the board in positions of authority, from companies to the media to academia, and practically in all sectors. But most important, AAPIs, in fact, are the most underrepresented of all racial groups in politics. AAPIs are the least likely to be elected to public office. Least of all racial groups, and account for less than 1% of all elected leaders in the country. In effect, AAPIs are largely shut out of the halls of power, where decisions affecting the AAPI community are made. So Rosetta's question is, what can we do about it? So how do we educate and encourage political participation for Asian Americans in national policy decisions that affect the welfare of Asian Americans?
Bo, you go first because you're doing
I'm
tremendous
happy to.
job in Minnesota.
Yeah, happy to chime in a little bit on and provide some thoughts there. I think that, you know, one of the things that we can do is really just to encourage our communities to participate in understanding what the processes are that they might be involved in at the very local level, because I think sometimes we think about elected office and people tend to think about national office, right? Like the highest level that we see. And I think that that can be daunting and it feels very difficult to get there. But at the municipal level, there are so many opportunities for people to be engaged, whether it's your school board, whether it's your city council, county commissioners, state representatives or senates, or all of those. There are just many more seats in which people can actually be engaged in. But I think one of the things that we can do in our communities is to really think about programs like this, Julia, where you're providing that knowledge base for, I'm sorry, my dog is barking, that knowledge base for our communities to understand that you don't have to turn or go very far to understand how they might participate in these types of systems. And if they participate in meetings, then that gets them interested. And then they start to realize like, oh, somebody gets to sit in that seat and make a decision that impacts, what happens on my street, right? Like your street conditions are not decided in Congress, they're decided at the city council and things like that. And so I having worked with the community for a long time, people will often call me and talk about very local issues, even the laws that really govern police accountability. I tell them, yes, Congress has something to do with it, but that's really at the city level and at the state level. If you want a different type of rules to be, governing what happens to police accountabilities, you've got to be very engaged at the local level, right? Or if you want to know what curriculums are taught to your children, that's at the school board and at the state level and things like that. So I would just say demystifying the system to our communities is important, and then finding ways to encourage people who have an interest to participate in existing programs or creating our own programs that train candidates and train campaign staff. One of the things that I've observed in candidate trainings and then watching community members run campaigns is that we don't have enough people who understand how to run campaigns, right? And so a candidate might be very passionate, but if you don't have good campaign staff, you can't raise the money that you need, and you don't understand always the process for endorsements and all of those things. So I would just think that thinking about how we also move from, yes, serving our communities, but also creating leadership programs and opportunities so that our folks can be much more ready and able to participate in these types of opportunities. Yeah.
And I'll say that special shout out, hello to Rosetta Lai. It's been a long time. So it's great to see your question. But I'll also say that for anyone, for anybody, everybody, you ought to really look at Minnesota, look at the Hmong community, and Bo as a major leader in there, and then her partner in crime, right, Kai-Yin Yang, the two of them have really transformed politically Minnesota and the political power of the Hmong American community there. And it's a tremendous model, how in a very short period of time, you've actually gotten a lot of your people into the pipeline, and that is through leadership training, campaign training, but really getting them into all different levels. When I worked for the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies, and this was 2001 to 2005, I basically knew almost all of the Asian American electeds in the US outside of Hawaii, because there's so few on the mainland. One of the things I often said at the time is that, this was in 2001, 2005, that for school board, Asian Americans were constantly talking about how important education is. But the number of school board members nationwide at that time outside of Hawaii was literally a little bit over 100. And almost all of them were in the state of California. There were literally one in Iowa, one in, whatever state, I mean, there were literally just one. And so it's so important that if education policy is so important to our community, we need to get people onto school boards. The other thing is actually, I didn't realize how important the planning council is, but it's really important to get our people into the planning council at that city level. And that is a major stepping stone up the political ladder. I would also take it down even into the schools. And today I hosted a meeting for Asian American interns in Washington, D.C. to learn about AARP and internship opportunities. And I met this one young man who was from Washington University in St. Louis, and he was the student body president. We need to have more of our community members at that time level, either at the high school or the college level, to be student body president or student governing council, because that's a tremendous training ground as well.
Well, that's a very nice sort of ending to open the conversation to the audience. But before we do that, let me give a shout out, like Daphne, to Pauline Tsui, who I with her, I should say, co-founded the Organization of Chinese American Women many years ago. And this program is dedicated to her because she was certainly a pioneer for women's rights, Asian American women's status. I use that word broadly speaking. So I really want to thank her memory and to thank her support, because it is because of the foundation that she set up, the Ruth Kwa and Rhoda Howe Memorial Fund. They were her aunts that this program is possible. So, Malin, we're ready and open to the audience questions.
All right, thank you, Ambassador Block. So the first question comes from Amber Chung, and they ask, how do we bring awareness of AAPI and visibility in the workplace in our communities?
Well, maybe I'll start. So I'll just give an example. At AARP, we're about 2,500 employees nationwide, and we have a small Asian American employee group. One of the things is that the employee resource groups are really very important. So I'm always encouraging Asian Americans to join our Asian American employee resource group, and also to take leadership role, because I've seen how people who are chairs of that ERG, how their visibility is raised within the enterprise, how they are able to be identified for various tasks and roles and responsibilities. Also, I always get speaking engagement opportunities, right? And I don't need them anymore, really, right? So what I'm trying to do is to farm it out so that all my colleagues within AARP, the Asian American staff, have an opportunity to take speaking engagements, because we need to raise their visibility within the AARP, but also externally as well too. And so I think, therefore, for us as leaders, that we need to continue to share our wealth with our colleagues, and also be able to nurture them, to be able to mentor them, to be able to put them into opportunities. There was one of my colleagues who I asked to moderate a session actually with Richard Louie, and she was scared to death to do, and this was virtually, because it was so outside her comfort zone. And so I made her do it. And to this day, she's very grateful that I made her do it, because she stepped outside her comfort zone to be able to moderate a session. And she was fantastic. And right now, actually next month, she's going to co-chair a regional conference for the Center for APA Women. So it's those kind of opportunities that we need as leaders to step back and bring others up.
Amen. Bo?
Yeah, that was such a great response, Daphne. I just really think that, within companies right now, there is a movement to create employee resource groups to support all kinds of diversity that we have. And if there's not an API group, I think that, it's important to ask. And then if sometimes some companies have it, some don't. And so, being able to participate in those, I know that oftentimes people talk about how difficult that can be because it's not part of their job, and then they have to figure out how to participate, but how important it is to be able to participate, because it does give you a different voice in the company and things like that. And then taking up those opportunities to be public, so that you can educate your colleagues and talk about those things. So I thought Daphne's response was really great.
Okay, Malin, we're ready for the next.
Yes, we are. So on the topic of careers, I think that Bo and Daphne, your illustrious careers really inspired some of the audience members. And we have an anonymous attendee who asks, what are some actionable steps to start a career in diversity and inclusion?
Boy. Yeah, so one, I mean, I think that there are the field has grown so significantly in the last couple of decades. And so there are certainly all types of certifications and things that people can get in DEI now, right? And so, and then companies have established whole departments or arms of their companies to look at DEI. And I think that's an important place to source to understand how, how a company is structured and how that is incorporated, and then looking for opportunities to join there, making sure that you are connected to the field of that provides that kind of expertise to companies and things like that. We have different forums where it is just for employees who specialize and have that kind of expertise, right? So I'm not sure, the question was kind of vague, so I would just encourage you to both participate in those kinds of learning opportunities, to seek out certifications that give you that expertise, and then to understand how a company is structured, so that you can enter the right field. And if you happen to be, I also have friends and colleagues who go into a company, and then as opportunities open up in the DEI space that they become interested in, they request to be moved or apply to be able to move into that opportunity. So I think this is the right time, because I've never seen DEI be, I think, as invested in as it is now. And I hope that you find the path that makes sense for you. Mm-hmm.
Malin, I have questions if you don't have any live ones.
I have some follow-ups.
Okay.
I just have two more. So the next question is going to turn more towards current affairs. So Lily Chung in the audience asks, are you worried about the current deteriorating US-China relations on the issues that you're talking about? Do you see a new storm coming? So essentially, how do those affairs factor into what we're talking about tonight?
Well, absolutely. Very, very, very concerned about the US-China issue because one of the things is most people, and myself included, we cannot distinguish among ourselves. Are we Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, Hmong American? So therefore, unfortunately, the monolith of the Asian American community, we're all lumped in together. So while the target may be China and Chinese Americans, but unfortunately, it's impacting all of us. I have often said throughout my years as in my career that the one issue, unfortunately, that unites all of us Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, is hate crime, because people can't distinguish us. And so therefore, we're bound together as we become victims of hate. We know that we're headed into the 2024 presidential election, and every election cycle, but especially the presidential elections, when the stakes are so high, candidates are looking for the enemy. And unfortunately, over the last many election cycles, it always looks towards Asia, right? Is it South Korea, North Korea, China? And so therefore, we know that the rhetoric gets ramped up in order to be able to win votes. But who are the ones that are going to become the targets for more anti-Asian hate? Questions of loyalty to the US, it is us as Asian Americans. And so I keep saying every day I have this conversation with people, I'm literally bracing for between now and the next November for how we as a community are going to have to continue to respond to the anti-Asian hate, the sentiment, to the constant question of loyalty to the United States. And so we all need to speak up when we are attacked.
Oh,
Yeah, I don't have more to add to that. I mean, just echoing that sentiment that anytime we hear rhetoric that is anti-China, it impacts Asian Americans in a very specific way. And I think it's really important for all of us to understand that so that we can, obviously that's a relationship that is ongoing and has to be talked about and things, but I don't think our media and sometimes our elected officials have the sensitivity to understand how it impacts our communities. And so it's really important for all of us to be on the same page about how framing of those issues ultimately impact Asian Americans, because Daphne is right. When I talk to people who are impacted by anti-Asian hate, nobody is asking them what their ethnicity is. It's all perception, right? So it's important that we not just brace ourselves, but that we are proactive about how that is presented, because the general public uses that information in a very specific way, right?
I would also say that, we've been talking about representation, how important it is to get more Asian Americans elected to office. We also have to make sure that they are qualified and would be good candidates, right? We can't just support any Asian that's running for office, but we also have to really speak up and protect Asian American elected officials or candidates that we know are solid and good, but that are being attacked for their loyalty. And we've seen it time and time again. Our current elected officials, members of Congress, Ted Lieu, I'll give Ted Lieu, member of Congress. He served in the U.S. Army JAG as an attorney, and yet his loyalty was being questioned, that he was pro-China, and yet. But
what about Judy Chu?
What was that?
What about Judy Chu?
Judy Chu, absolutely right, Judy Chu. So there are our elected officials. We need to rally. We need to speak up against those that are questioning their loyalty. These people of all people, right, who have served public service their entire life, served in the U.S. military. I mean, how much more patriotic can that be? So we must be alert. We must speak out.
I would just add one more point. No one can be not worried by the deterioration of U.S.-China relations. Should our two countries, the two biggest powers in the world, not get along, if we march in the direction of deterioration of relations, we could go over the cliff. Mm-hmm. War would be catastrophe. especially we need to remember that both the US and China are nuclear powers.
Mhm.
That's all I have to say.
Absolutely.
Thank you for all your comments, guys. So I would like to pull on the thread of representation some more. So we have a follow-up question from Victoria Moy, and she asks, what do you all think of the current more diverse depictions of AAPI communities in television, film, and theater?
Who's a movie fan?
Well, I think at this point, all of us probably are really, I mean, I think I, for one, am just delighted to see more people who look like me, right? I'm not talking about the story choices or all of those things, but how it has been really wonderful to have that kind of representation and to be able to see, I guess it feels like an acceptance of the faces and the welcoming of kind of I mean, we all love, hopefully, different types of genres of Asian film for a long time. So we knew that there were these actors and actresses and people in all kinds of media and things. But I think to see it in the general audience, I was saying that I took my daughter to a BTS concert in New Jersey, and I cannot tell you how diverse that audience was. And then they were all singing in Korean. And I just thought how funny it was, right? That in this audience, you had, Hispanic teenagers, you had white teenagers, you had all kinds of, teenagers, and then they were all singing in Korean. And I, in my lifetime, would never thought that would happen, right? So
Okay, but we need to hear you sing BTS.
no, I cannot. I was happy to watch them be so happy about it, but it was just, I think the recognition that there is a lot of gift in the community is really wonderful. And I hope that this continues to just accelerate, because we have many more kinds of storylines that should be told, right? Like I love, Crazy Rich Asians, but that's not a true representation of all of us, right? And so, I think, and Everything Everywhere all at the same time was really wonderful and things. But we also have Asians who just live real lives in America whose stories deserve to be told, right? We don't always have to be foreign. We don't always have to be, that. So I hope to continue to see the diversity of stories told and to have many more Asian Americans, in particular in media too. We certainly do not have enough Asian Americans in the media. And so, yeah.
And I'd say that we have to be very thankful and grateful for Asian American leaders in Hollywood, like Tamlyn Tomita, George Takei, Janet Yang, who have been advocating, Daniel Day Kim, who have been speaking up and advocating and guiding the next generation of Asian Americans in Hollywood. Their roles have been continuous over all these years. I'll also just throw out there that this September will be the 30th anniversary of Joy Luck Club. And so we can really see how we've come in the, 30 years ago, the very first Asian American film and all the few films in between, and now celebrating the 30th anniversary. I'll also say that there are now so many Asian Americans behind the camera as producers, directors, and all those different roles. And so it's really exciting to see. And those that are writing the scripts as well too. So very proud of all of them, and that, as we all know, that storytelling is a tremendous way of educating and informing Americans and the broader international community about the Asian American experience.
Well, you said he's preparing a Trailblazers webinar on film. So I don't have much to share with you right now, but watch our website, because there will be an upcoming program, because this is an area where I think that we should pay some attention, especially now when Asian Americans in in film and entertainment have this opportunity of being recognized. So that's great. Okay, Malin, anything else?
Yeah, I think I have a great closing question that'll be good for both panelists. It's a very simple one, and that is, what has been your proudest moments in your work and throughout your career?
All right, you go first, Bo.
Yeah. I think for me, I don't know if I can point to one moment, but I'm just extremely proud that that there are leaders who come after me, right? I really feel fortunate to have founded a number of organizations, and those organizations still exist, and there are leaders who have stepped up to run them. And so it makes me feel proud that I was able to contribute to creating and to organizations that make people feel like they could participate and step up and to serve the community. And I think public service is really important for all of us, and ensuring our communities are able to thrive into the future. So I just feel proud that those organizations are still around, and that I had a hand in creating them, and have fostered so that younger leaders feel like it's something that they too can do. So, yeah.
I'll say that for me, I often get asked that question. I have to say, I'm so proud of former interns, former staff that I've worked with over the decades, who are now elected officials, appointed officials, leading nonprofit organizations, serving the community, in charge of redistricting for the state of California, or heading up, the Association of Asian Pacific Entertainers. And so, having and seeing these careers, also in the public sector as well, to me, that is the most gratifying thing, is to continue to see people I've worked with, hopefully have nurtured, mentored, and led the way, that they are really making the mark all over the country and in all different fields, but serving whether the Asian American community or communities of color, but they're all doing good stuff.
I guess, Malin, it's time for me to wrap up. I would say that I am very proud of the fact that I have Daphne Kwok on this Trailblazers program, because she and I go back a very long time with Pauline Tsui, when OCAW was first founded, one of, if not the first, national Chinese American women's organization. And Daphne was a kid then. And just think, she is now a trailblazer. And look at the impact that she is having. So I agree with both of you. I mean, it's the pride is not so much in yourself, but in the next generation, as Bo said, that we have seen or helped along the way. And Bo, you're a new friend. So I'm looking for, I don't know how much more years I will have, but I'm looking forward to the next iteration of our, getting together. So on behalf of USCET, I thank both of you really for your time, for your really insightful comments, for your contributions to the AAPI community. So I thank you, as well as the USCET team, and Malin particularly, for putting this program together. I certainly wouldn't be able to do it. Technologically, I am a fossil, but let's all look forward to the future. I think what comes out of this discussion is that there is a lot of hope. There's hope. There is a lot more to be done, but we should build on our achievements to date. So thank you all very much. I think it's time. It's exactly on time.
Thank you, Julia, and to your team. And that was fun, Bo.
Yeah, nice to be with you both. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for being with us. Thank you. And
Okay.
contributing, making this series, I think, not only fun, but important.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.